Hi, this is Gabe Ignetti, and welcome to our new show, the Ecomodernist Soapbox. We're here every Wednesday from 8 o'clock Eastern and 4 o'clock Pacific, and we get into everything and anything. It's just like, kind of a rant and discussion with other eco-modernists. And we have our initial show, and our guest today is Robert Zubrin. We're very lucky to have him. And let me tell you a little bit about Robert. Robert is head and founder of the Mars Society. He holds a master's degree in aeronautics and astronautics and a PhD in nuclear engineering from the University of Washington. He's author of 14 books, over 200 technical and non-technical papers in areas related to aerospace and energy, and he's an inventor of over 20 patents, including space propulsion and exploration. What we're speaking today about is about his new book, The Case for Nukes. How you doing, Robert? Welcome to our show.
I'm doing great. Thanks for inviting me.
Wonderful. Well, why did you write this book?
Because this has now become critical. The people who have made an issue of global warming are using it to push a reactionary program of limiting human possibilities. They're saying that because of the existential threat posed by carbon emissions, we have to drastically cut living standards. And starting with effectively increasing the price of food. This is an extremely regressive program. It's going to cause great misery around the world, and it has to be debunked. Now, as I explained in the book, there is an issue with carbon emissions, okay, and I'll get to it. But the primary problem in the world today is poverty, okay? Poverty is the number one issue in the world. It causes the deaths of hundreds of millions of people every year, directly, both due to starvation and indirectly due to disease that is much more deadly to people who are malnourished, or people have to live their lives without their teeth or with defective vision because of vitamin deficiencies. And the people, even who have adequate health, have their lives shortened, and they have to live lives of brutal muscle labor, repetitive jobs, lack of opportunity for themselves, their children. Brutal social relations are caused by it. And this is the worst problem in the world. And now here's the thing. Okay, the average income in the United States is $50,000 a year. And we have some poverty here. But the average income worldwide is $10,000 a year. And half of the world is below average. So the problem of poverty on a global scale is enormous. And if we were to address this in a competent way, to at least reduce poverty to American levels worldwide, we would have to increase global energy use 5 times. And that does not even take into account population growth. And so this idea that we're going to radically reduce our energy consumption to reach net zero by the year 2030 or 2050 or anything of the sort is absolute nonsense, but it's being used to push horrendous programs. And it is interesting because the groups, not every individual, but if we're talking about the organized groups, the so-called environmentalist groups who are pushing this issue to the max, they oppose nuclear power. In fact, they oppose it much more fiercely than they oppose fossil fuels. The National Resources Defense Council, the Sierra Club, the Environmental Defense Fund, all extremely active in shutting down nuclear power plants. The German Green Party, which has shut down the entire German nuclear industry, coal and Russian gas, okay? And coal causes gigantic carbon emissions, and the Russian gas causes mass murder because they've been funding the genocidal Russian campaign in Ukraine by buying that gas. And there's frankly good evidence to show that many of the individuals involved in making that decision at the highest political levels were directly on the Russian payroll. In fact, one of them is currently on the board of Gazprom. But here's the thing. They hate nuclear power more than they hate fossil fuels. And the reason why is because it solves a problem they need to have. The problem they need to have is carbon emissions. The problem they need to have is a putative necessity to reduce human living standards, in particularly to loot the poor. That's what you're talking about. And look, if you double the price of food, you're not going to hurt millionaires. You will hurt the poor. And so that's what that program is. So the point is, there is an alternative that does not require implementing this reactionary program, and that is nuclear power. And nuclear power offers a source of energy literally millions of times greater in size than that offered by fossil fuels, and without any carbon emissions.
It just sounds so absurdly crazy. And I'm not saying you're wrong, because I mean, I don't believe most humans are rational. I've come to that conclusion. Maybe that's just being jaded, but it's really a crazy thought. I always kind of pictured it as environmentalists, these environmental organizations, that they're caught up in the appeal to nature fallacy. And that is kind of their religion. And based on that, they have this also nirvana fallacy that they could do both. Nuclear power is not green because it's not natural, which is not true.
Well, wait a second. Now, here's...
Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. You can destroy a tree or you can split an atom. Which is better for nature?
I agree.
You can kill whales or you can drill for oil. I mean, it's Rockefeller saved the whales. Okay. If you want to help nature, don't draw your resources from it. It is precisely because nuclear power is artificial rather than, quote unquote, natural. Because nuclear power draws on a resource that the biosphere does not draw from. And so you're being kind to nature by not looting it. Okay. Similarly, oil, the biosphere does not really use it very much, as opposed to whales or palm trees or this kind of thing. So to save the natural, use the artificial.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. The way I look at it, and I always present this to anti-nuke people, is that the entire planet is, and Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson always says this too, and I kind of really repeating him, the entire planet is a nuclear furnace that is revolving around a more gigantic nuclear furnace. And radiation is ubiquitous. I mean, it is natural. So I don't agree that it's not natural. In fact, I would go so far as to say it's the only truly renewable source of energy.
Okay, well, let me put it this way. If you have a kilogram of uranium and a kilogram of lithium-ion battery, you would have to recharge and discharge that battery something like 30 million times in order to have it produce enough energy as the kilogram of uranium. This would take hundreds of thousands of years if you did it every day. And of course, the energy is not actually coming from the battery. It would have to come from something else, putting it into the battery. So, and of course, no battery would last 30 million discharges. That's the thing here. There's no better battery. Well, actually, there is one better battery than a kilogram of uranium, and that's a kilogram of deuterium. It has 4 times as much energy per unit mass as uranium.
Okay.
But still either have tens of millions of times more energy per unit mass than fossil fuels and hundreds of millions of times more energy per unit mass than batteries. So that's why I wrote the book. I am against the program of keeping the poor down. I am for the program of making sure that every person on this planet has an opportunity to a decent standard of living. I think that should be humanity's project for the 21st century.
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned about CO2 and global warming and how serious a thing is it? I mean, to you.
Okay, that's
I mean,
an excellent
there's many
question.
opinions on that.
Yeah,
You
okay.
know?
Well, let's start with the facts. Global warming is real, although it's modest. The Earth's average temperature has increased by 1 degree centigrade since 1870. That's a fact. And it can be proven, by the way, more convincingly using evidence that the environmentalists don't show. Because the most convincing evidence of global warming is not sensitive measurements taken by thermometers. It is the fact that the growing season has expanded. Okay? That's something that's easy to measure. It's expanded by 3 weeks since the beginning of the 20th century. But they never talk about that because it is a positive development. But it is a fact, and global warming is a fact. And a 1 degree temperature rise is responsible for that. And as far as that's concerned, that's been a good thing. Now, there's other things happening too, because carbon emissions, they cause a change in atmospheric chemistry. Okay, so fossil fuels actually have 3 effects. One, which is actually immediate and dramatic, is conventional pollution, smog, particulate emissions, carbon monoxide, nitric oxides, things like this that are directly annoying and impact public health. And this stuff kills about 4 million people a year, which is substantial, although nowhere near as much as poverty. So overall, as far as public health is concerned, fossil fuels have been tremendously beneficial, but there's no question that they have a measurable downside. Now, then there is the increase in CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere, which since the 19th century have gone from 280 parts per million to 420. That's an increase of 50%. That's significant. That's much more significant than a 1 degree temperature rise. 1 degree temperature rise is the equivalent of a New Yorker moving to central New Jersey. Okay, and actually, the New Yorkers that are leaving aren't leaving for New Jersey; they're leaving for Florida. So nobody is really being bothered by the temperature increase, but the CO2 increase. Okay, now that is something that's had an effect. Now it's had 2 effects actually, on land and on water. On land, it has been beneficial. It has increased the rate of plant growth. And there's no question about this. We have photographs taken from orbit showing that the rate of plant growth on land has increased about 20% since 1985. Okay, that's real. And it can't be denied. And it's totally predictable given what we know about photosynthesis, which uses CO2 as a critical resource. But in the ocean, this has not occurred.
Yeah, that's the bad part.
Right. Because the limiting factor for plant growth, phytoplankton growth in the ocean is not CO2. It's trace elements like iron and nitrogen and things like this. And this is only really present in good amounts in the ocean in coastal areas, estuaries, and specific upwelling areas. And that's why about 90% of the biological productivity of the ocean occurs within about 10% of the ocean, and the rest of it is practically a desert. And without the trace elements, the CO2 just carbonates the ocean, and it starts changing the ability of sea life to create shells, for example. Very
ocean
important.
acidification. That's
Yes.
ocean acidification is big.
Correct.
Exactly.
Now, so far, those effects have been measured. They're still limited. But if we were to increase human CO2 emissions 5 times, which we would need to do if we were to remain dependent upon fossil fuels and wish to end poverty, that would then become serious. Because now we're not talking about 400 parts per million, we're talking about 1,500 parts per million or more. And now you'd start to see some serious effects. And that's an experiment we don't want to run. So if we are going to carry out this program of increasing human living standards, and by the way, I think this program is going to be carried out, whether anyone wants to or not, because people don't want to be poor. In the 20th century, the average income per capita in the world increased by about a factor of 10. And this happened despite 2 world wars and a depression. an enormous waste of resources in the Cold War. Because nevertheless, with all that going on, inventors continue to invent and products continue to be bought by people who would buy the best thing they could buy with their money, which therefore encourages better things to be made and better deals to be offered. And so you get progress. And even in countries that are not free, there is progress because the rulers of those countries know that the essential condition for them remaining in power is offering a certain amount of progress to their people or allowing it.
Yeah. And I'm all for this, right? The problem with nuclear power in the third world is a financial problem because it's an enormous upfront investment, which will pay off much better, I believe, than coal. And tell me if I'm wrong about that. But these poor countries don't have the money and they don't have the time to wait for that construction and they don't have the expertise.
Okay, well, let's talk about this. And I discuss this at length in my book, The Case for Nukes. Okay. The original nuclear power plants built in the United States were built within a time of 3 years. That is both the Nautilus and the first nuclear submarine and the shipping port plant in Pennsylvania. Took 3 years to build them. Okay. And their cost per kilowatt hour was extremely competitive against fossil fuels and even against hydroelectric power. But what happened was systematically, the anti-nukes imposed a hostile regulatory structure, which has increased the time it takes to build a nuclear power plant in the United States from 3 years to 16, more than 5 times. And
how long?
What? 16. And yes.
To 6 years?
16 years.
I thought you said that.
That's what I said.
Man.
From 3 years to 16, multiplied 5 times. And
wow.
And I have the data in the book where as this thing unfolded over time and the time doubled and tripled and eventually quintupled, the cost to the plants went up as time squared. Okay, now you'd think it would just go up with time since, after all, cost is people times time. But the longer it takes, the more problems and lawsuits and so forth accrete to the project. And lawyers cost a lot more than plumbers. And they do. And so the cost of nuclear power has gone up about 25 times in the United States.
Wow.
Because of this regulatory sabotage. Now, in China and South Korea, it still takes 4 years to build a nuclear power plant. Okay. Now, by the way, the time should have gone down, not up. The time should have gone down because as we became more familiar with nuclear power, it should have become easier to do. Instead, the regulatory system made it harder and harder to do and also prevented any improvements because it's hard enough to get a nuclear power plant that they're completely familiar with licensed without trying to introduce a technological improvement. So, oh, that's new, that's strange, I don't get that. So it prevented any progress beyond the light water reactor introduced by Rickover in the 50s.
Well, could I stop you there for a minute? Okay, I think there are kind of 2 ways that regulations could function, and that their proper function is increased safety and worker safety, public safety in this case. And of course, the other thing is stuff like a LIRA, as low as reasonably attainable, regardless
low is reasonably achievable. Yeah,
achievable, right? Regardless of what the science says about radiation. So some of those regulations, I think, especially following 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, all these accidents, I'm sure that some of those regulations were good regulations. So if you separate the good from the bad, what does that look like? It still looks like that much of a difference or what?
Okay, here's the thing. You can have useful regulations. We have the Federal Aviation Administration, and it's there to make sure you can fly airplanes safely.
Right.
Okay. But it understands that its mission is to make sure we can have an aviation industry that flies safely. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission does not operate that way. If the FAA operated like the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, we would have no airplanes. In my book, The Case for Nukes, I discuss this at great length. The Carter administration is the one that radically changed the regulatory structure. that made it incredibly difficult to get a plant approved. There's a diagram in my book showing the 32-step process you have to go through to get a nuclear power plant approved. And it looks like the New York subway system. And actually, it's more complicated than that, because within each of those subway stops, there's a whole nother subway system. And for example, one of the subway stops is called the Environmental Protection Agency. And it will not only take forever to examine your permit, I mean, they will also require you to produce answers to questions like, prove to us that your decision to build a nuclear power plant was correct. Why not build something else? Imagine if you
That's not a hard question, by the way.
No, but no. I just want to let me make this one clear.
Go ahead.
Imagine if you had some land, okay, and you decide to build a log cabin on it. Well, you got to submit your plans to the town government and make sure so they can see that it's got all the things that a house is supposed to have and be safe from fires and such. Okay, fine. Okay, but now imagine that the town says to you, you need to prove to us that building a log cabin was the correct decision. Why not an A-frame? Why not a chalet? Why not a Cape Cod? Why not a candy store? Why not a zoo?
It's a stupid question.
Prove to us that this was the right thing to do. And so somehow you managed to do that. Okay.
Yeah.
You convinced the mayor that it really needs to be a Cape Cod, it shouldn't be a chalet. Okay. But now it's open to interveners to challenge the mayor's approval decision. And they can take the city to court for approving your log cabin. And now you have to prove in front of a judge and jury that the decision was valid. And you somehow do that. And then they appeal it to the higher court. And you got to do it all over again. This is how nuclear power is being regulated. Imagine that you want to go on a road trip. Okay, the way it works is now, correctly, if you speed, the cops stop you and give you a ticket. Well, that's fair. Okay, but imagine if the system instead was, before you go on a road trip, you got to go to the police station and prove to the police that you're not going to speed. And not only that, prove to the police that you should go on a road trip instead of staying home. You can't go anywhere. And that's how this thing is being run. And I'm originally a nuclear engineer. Most of my career has been in aerospace, but my PhD is in nuclear engineering, and I worked a bit in the field. And early on, and in the 80s, okay, I was working for the Washington State Office of Radiation Protection, and we had some regulatory authority concerning a Trojan plant, which was...
You were in the belly of the beast, so in other words.
Yeah, just across the border.
Okay.
Well, now here's the thing. The Trojan plant was a very good plant. It was producing electricity at 2 cents a kilowatt hour, fully competitive with the Pacific Northwest very cheap hydroelectric power. It was a great plant, but it had a problem, which was it had corrosion in the secondary loop, the steam loop. And the utility knew what the problem was. They said, well, this is a carbon steel loop and we need to replace it with stainless. And they were willing to do that. But the NRC said, no, you can't do that. Because when you put in your application, you said that this was going to be carbon steel, and now you want to switch it to stainless steel. And they said, yeah, it's better. And they said, it's a change. You need to get a new license if you want to do that. And now, this is now in 1988, and this plant had been built in the 70s when you could build a plant. And by the late 80s, is already impossibly complex to get a permit. The utility says, no way we're going back for a new license. So they just kept on replacing the carbon steel pipes every 6 months. I mean, this was hardly a revolutionary improvement or a new change in the plant. Nobody was talking about turning the Trojan plant into a breeder reactor or anything. They were just talking about replacing some rusting carbon steel plumbing with stainless. The NRC wouldn't let them do it. So that's how regulation can stop progress. Okay, when they won't let you innovate or even correct a problem.
Yeah. You know, you got to ask why for all of this. And like my answer, which would seem to be deductive logic, that's when you just eliminate all the possibilities. It would seem that it's really the fossil fuel industry, and there's evidence of this, it's not a conspiracy theory, that has kind of turned the anti-nuke movement and anti-nuke people into their useful idiots. in order to protect their industry from the competition.
Well,
And
there's some truth to that. That was true in the early 70s. The environmental groups, they are businesses, and they have an asset to sell, which are groups of people who are hostile to industry in general. Okay. But
yes,
the question is, which industry becomes the target? Well, money talks. So yes, in the early 70s, the oil industry was, after the oil price went up due to the Arab oil embargo. At that time, we still generated 20% of our electricity in the United States from oil, and it had become uneconomic, and it was threatened with nuclear power. So both Atlantic Richfield and Exxon gave large donations to environmental groups to go after the nuclear industry. Okay, so that, yes, that did happen, and that's discussed in my book. However,
yeah,
in the more recent period, the people who've been funding environmentalists to go after nuclear power are the solar power and wind people. And
they're
also,
very
to some
powerful
extent,
industry, right?
the
Yeah,
natural
they've
gas
become
and even the
right.
natural gas group as well. The environmental groups, they are businesses, and they have an asset to sell, which are groups of people who are hostile to industry in general. Okay. But the
Yes,
question is, which industry becomes the target? Well, money talks. So yes, in the early 70s, the oil industry was, after the oil price went up due to the Arab oil embargo. At that time, we still generated 20% of our electricity in the United States from oil, and it had become uneconomic, and it was threatened with nuclear power. So both Atlantic Richfield and Exxon gave large donations to environmental groups to go after the nuclear industry. Okay, so that, yes, that did happen, and that's discussed in my book. However,
yeah,
in the more recent period, the people who've been funding environmentalists to go after nuclear power are the solar power and wind people. And
they're
also,
very
to some
powerful
extent,
industry, right?
the
Yeah,
natural
they've
gas
become
and even the
right.
natural gas group as well. You've got some people with anti-industry mobs to sell, and they'll sell them to the people willing to give them money, and they'll go after those people's targets. So that's what it is. But there's a deeper problem here, because the overall agenda of stopping industrial progress, okay,
Yeah,
was conceived of by not exactly a conspiracy, but a social layer, an aristocracy. You know, they formed this group in 72 called the Club of Rome, and they published a book called The Limits to Growth, in
right.
which
Very
they
famous.
said, we're going to run out of everything by the year 2000. And we can prove it because we have a computer. And here's what the computer says, because the computer is an infallible oracle. Okay. And it says they got this much oil and it's using at this rate, and therefore it will be gone in 28 years. And the copper will last 29 years, and the zinc will last 27 years, and so forth. And the only way to stop this is by limiting population growth and the expansion of consumption, i.e., rising living standards. And this was very widely promoted, and it became a doctrine.
Yeah,
And people who opposed it were viewed as, you know, Neanderthals from the Chamber of Commerce who just want to keep making money because they don't understand that we're running out of everything and they just got to stop doing this. No. Okay. And so, for instance, Sierra Club in the 60s had been pro-nuclear
right.
because it doesn't produce all the smoke of the fossil fuels. But in 1974, they come out against nuclear power. And in their statement where they explain this, because before to their membership, they were pro-nuclear, they said, we have to be against nuclear power because it could encourage unnecessary economic growth. And then they said as well, and this is discussed in the book, Case for Nukes, how are we going to stop nuclear power? We're going to stop it by stopping them from disposing of their waste. We're going to make waste disposal an insoluble problem for the industry, and that's going to wreck the industry. So, Carter administration, which was heavily influenced by these people, comes in 1977, stops nuclear waste reprocessing, which is done in France, by the way, but we don't do it. It stopped subsea bed disposal of nuclear waste, okay? And then it said the only way we're going to dispose of nuclear waste is by building this, multi-billion-dollar facility in the desert. Okay. Expensive, multi-decade project with all kinds of incredible requirements, such as it won't harm people for 10,000 years, which means people who might not be able to read English because they'll be the nomads who live on North America after the next.
Oh yeah, no.
Okay. And we had to guarantee that they would be safe. Okay. So this thing takes forever to build, and then the Democrats themselves start opposing its construction and ultimately stop it. Biden administration just stopped it. Okay. And so what does it mean? It means that the nuclear waste has to be stored at the power plants in the suburbs of American cities. Now, who could believe that it is safer to store nuclear waste in the suburbs of Chicago than under a mountain in the desert, Nevada? I mean, really.
Right.
And it's absurd. They're trying to make it as unsafe as they can make it. And they say, but okay, there's no solution for nuclear waste. Guess what? There is. Okay. The Navy stores nuclear waste in salt caverns in New Mexico. Okay. Because the Navy isn't having any of this stuff. Because you got to have nuclear submarines. The diesel submarine does not compare to a nuclear submarine. It has to surface. A nuke does not. So there it is. And so they say, well, we're going to store our nuclear waste, and we're not going to store it on the Navy base. We're going to put it in the salt caverns in New Mexico. Boom. This is not a technically difficult problem.
No, it's not.
It's like somebody saying parking cars is impossible because the city has passed a law against parking cars.
That's a good analogy. That's a good analogy. But how about wind and solar? Comparatively, I believe that nuclear power is better just on the basis of E equals MC squared. I mean, the small energy density involved, which to me makes it much more environmentally friendly. And I believe there is a problem with critical resources. We had Dr. Simon Michau. I don't know if you know him, but he was on one of our programs, and he was speaking about the relationship between the use of critical materials, because it is a problem. You need to conserve it, but it's not something that's a game stopper. And what he was saying, I mean, if you just plastered wind and solar all across the planet and for this 100% renewable dream, you are going to run out of these materials. And there's another thing that came out that says that was saying that the amount of habitat destruction would really accelerate the species extinction on the planet. So I just don't go with that. But it would seem that there are good uses for solar because it's fast and it is cheap. Would you agree with that? What do you think about wind and solar?
I'll tell you, look, the great thing about wind and solar is they are off-grid power sources. And so therefore, wind in particular has had an enormous positive influence on the development of human civilization. It allowed wind-driven sailing ships to unite the world into a global system. And human progress accelerated greatly once Europeans built ocean-going sailing ships capable of traveling all the way to China. And then once that was done, major innovations, which previously took centuries to travel around the world, could travel around the world in less than a year or so, and it greatly accelerated progress. And Western civilization in particular put a lot of work into mastering the exploitation of water wheels and then windmills and so forth, and transferring labor from off people's backs to mechanical machines. And this actually drove human civilization really together with combustion of wood, which is a form of solar energy, up to the year 1800. However, even in certain places by the 1500s and very broad parts of the world by 1800s, these sources of energy were no longer sufficient. And they had to be transcended by introducing fossil fuels, which are far more abundant and concentrated sources of energy, and even drove wind power from its premier place, driving ships in the middle of the ocean. Solar power is nice for satellites because they're off grid too.
Yeah.
But to think that we're going to drive modern industrial society with sources of energy that were inadequate 200 years ago is utterly fantastical. They're now going to face with energy rationing in Germany because of their brilliant program of transitioning from nuclear power to wind and solar.
I think that solar does play a good role, but it's a limited role. When you have hydro, we have a lot of problems with the climate change, which is actually causing drought. And it's causing areas that have hydro, where the hydro is not dependable because of the lack of water. And at the same time, you have these heat waves that are causing it. And that's just what happened in China. And I know, for example, in places like by the Grand Coulee, I believe it is, near Vegas and all of that, there's a lot of very dry land. If you had solar installations to complement your hydro, they would be able to pick up the slack and allow these hydro dams to recharge a bit, So I
could
could
do that
see
with a nuke as well, far more reliable.
Yeah, you could do that.
Well, the idea that if we're faced with climate change, that we're going to go to power sources which are dependent on the weather is ridiculous. The wind, solar, and then to a lesser extent hydro are weather dependent. So if your problem is climate change, the last thing you want to do is switch to weather dependent power sources.
Right. Well, let me ask you this, though, because it seems from everything that I've seen that, okay, solar and wind are cheaper minus the buffering, which is extremely expensive. So that's why I mentioned it that way. I mean, are you saying that that's not really true?
I'm saying that, well, first of all, you're correct in that since solar and wind are unreliable energy sources.
Of course.
Okay, they have to be 100% backed up by reliable energy sources, which is either nuclear, fossil fuels, or hydro.
Right, exactly.
Okay? Those are the ones you can count on. Okay, so then the question is, why are you even bothering with the unreliable energy sources? Because you have to build the entire capacity. What if it's cloudy for a few days in a row? Where's your solar power? Okay, there's this thing called
we know that. Of course.
Yeah, so it's ridiculous. Now, look, people got to understand this. Okay, uranium has 10 million times the amount of energy per unit mass as oil, and that means that if you take not even uranium ore, just an average piece of granite, like you see a rock, okay? Mountains are made of it. Buildings are made of it. They have 2 parts per million uranium and 8 parts per million thorium in it, which means that the average granite rock contains about 100 times the amount of energy in nuclear form as an equal mass of oil. Now, furthermore, if we go to fusion, a gallon of water has 350 times as much energy as an equal mass of oil.
Oh, yeah.
We
don't know when that's coming.
by gigantic amounts of energy, provided we are allowed to unleash it through the power of mind. So that's what these people are trying to stop. And these other sources, okay, they require huge amounts of land, which means you're robbing nature of land. The production of solar panels is incredibly environmentally destructive. It involves the use of fluorine compounds, which cause massive fish kills and damage to public health in China. That's why they have slave labor building them. Okay?
That's true.
The windmills kill billions of birds, and also apparently...
How many? Did you say billions of birds?
Billions of birds.
Billions of birds. Wow.
Yes. Okay.
You covered that in your book, I guess, huh?
Yes. And so this is crazy, and we should not be doing this. We should be creating these vast energy resources. And this is a fundamental point, by the way, okay, which goes beyond this particular issue, but includes this issue.
Right.
Resources are creations. There's no such thing as a natural resource. There's only natural raw materials. It is human beings that turn materials into resources. Land was not a resource until people invented agriculture. Agriculture is not self-evident. Agriculture is based on a scientific finding, fundamental regularity in nature, that the seeds of a given plant are what produces that plant and only that plant. Okay? If you carry the seeds of a berry bush and you plant them, you can create a whole acre of berry bushes. So you don't have to go hunting all over the places for your berries.
Right.
Okay? That land is turned into a resource through that scientific understanding. Iron was not a resource until people invented kilns that were hot enough to smelt it. Do you know, for 3,000 years, we had this thing called the Bronze Age, during which time people used metals, but only a group of metals, copper, zinc, tin, lead, gold, silver, that
Right.
collectively amount to 100 parts per million in the Earth's crust. But once we got hotter, then we could smelt iron, which is 100,000 parts per million in the Earth's crust. So useful metals, going from bronze to iron, you increase the amount of useful metals available to people 1,000 times.
Mm.
And what that means is that instead of just making aristocratic weapons and artwork, you can now make axes for the common people and steel-tipped plows and things like this, saws, well, the Iron Age with all of its tools for the common people, which it causes a massive growth in living standards and also a massive expansion in arable land. So this iron becomes a resource. Aluminum is unknown to science until 1820, okay, and unknown to popular use until the 20th century because it requires electricity and knowledge of chemistry to produce it. But now
Right.
it's all over the place. We throw away aluminum cans, and we make airplanes out of it too that can travel the world in spacecraft. Uranium is not a resource until we discover nuclear power. Deuterium is not yet a resource because we don't have fusion yet, but when we do,
Yes.
it will be an enormous resource. So
Well, you say when? That's the big question. It seems so, I don't
it's
know.
going to happen.
You think
The
so?
physics is there. There's engineering problems. They will be solved. Now, by the way, one thing I discuss in my book is the new entrepreneurial companies that are seeking to advance both fission and fusion power. And the fusion ones in particular are very exciting because really, as a result of the success of SpaceX, Elon Musk's company, in achieving reusable space launch, the investors have looked at fusion and they said, maybe the problem with fusion is the same as the problem with reusable launchers. It was the wrong people trying to develop it. Instead of having government bureaucrats work on it, we need entrepreneurs. Okay.
Yeah.
And so you've got entrepreneurial fusion companies getting heavy duty investment, hundreds of millions of dollars. And these people are looking at developing fusion on time scales of 5 years, not 5 decades.
Wow, that's stunning. I'm a little skeptical, but moving on, you're kind of really advocating for like 100% nuclear. I guess.
No, where we have it, hydroelectric is very nice where you have it because it's
all right. Nuclear and hydro,
nuclear, hydro, and fossil fuels when particularly useful. I mean, fossil fuels are very attractive for portable things. Now, I think we can start making fuels with nuclear power. We can make hydrocarbons out of carbon dioxide and water if you have power.
Yes.
Okay.
How much?
You burn those fuels and it is no net carbon because the carbon dioxide in them came from carbon dioxide in the first place.
But how viable is that economically?
It'll be quite viable once you have widespread cheap nuclear power.
Yeah. And I guess economies of scale.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, it sounds actually necessary, to tell you the truth. It always comes down to the economics,
Right.
It always comes down to that. But here's another problem, though. If we're talking about worldwide build outs, and this is especially true in the third world, and kind of go back a little bit to that, but it's true everywhere. If you're going to have a massive worldwide build out, they say you need 10,000. This is what I've heard, 10,000 new nuclear reactors. you don't have the expertise right now. And that's going all the way from the nuclear engineers like you, right down to the welders. That you don't have enough people who are trained and educated to pull this off at this time. So that's a hurdle. How much of a hurdle is it? And can we reach the 10,000 mark? Yeah, I mean, is that something that's just pie in the sky like they claim?
No, there's about 1,000 pressurized water reactors on land and sea right now. And China intends to build another 1,000, about half domestically and half export to the third world between now and 2050. And that's just the Chinese. The United States, we were getting orders for 2 new big nuclear power plants every month in the early 70s. If we had been allowed to continue that, we would have completely nuclearized and decarbonized our entire electric grid by 1990.
Yeah.
France,
and we might not have been talking about climate today either because of that.
That's right. France did so.
Yeah.
Okay. So really, right now, if not for the anti-nuclear movement, every advanced country would already be over 80% zero emission power nuclear.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll tell you something. There's a deeper thing to all of this. People are afraid of change. When they first built the trains, people were scared of going over 20 miles an hour, what it would do to the human body. Then when they went to subways, people were afraid of traveling underground. There were mass demonstrations against subways before it started. And now it's accepted, so there's this kind of, I don't know, I guess reactionary, I don't know how to put it, but
yeah, people are afraid of things that are new.
Of modernity.
People are afraid of new things, but there are people fanning those fears.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, okay, let's take it from the Earth to the stars. What I'd like to know is, how about nuclear rocket propulsion and what role should it play in our space program?
Well, nuclear
forward?
Power can certainly be used for rocket propulsion, not for taking off from the ground, but for deep space propulsion. It also is absolutely necessary for the settlement of space, for instance, the settlement of Mars. There's no fossil fuels on Mars. Solar energy is only 40% as strong as that on Earth. The air is too thin to make much wind power. There won't be hydroelectric power until after the planet is terraformed. So nuclear is the only way to go. Even on the moon, where you have sunlight as strong as on Earth, there's 2 weeks of dark, 2 weeks of light. It's a tremendous energy storage problem with solar. If we go to the outer solar system, at Jupiter, solar energy is only 4% as strong as the Earth. At Saturn, 1% as strong. You go interstellar, it's absolutely negligible. So if we are to become a spacefaring species, we got to use nuclear power.
Yeah. Yeah, but okay, so these nuclear rockets, though, is there an advantage? Should they be taken off from Earth to space? I mean,
no, you don't want to use nuclear rockets to take off from the ground on Earth. It's conceivable one could use them on Mars.
Like how?
Really? Okay, there's 2 important uses for nuclear power vis-a-vis rocketry. One is, and this is very important, and it's in near term, it's the most important, which is as surface power, for instance, on Mars to make rocket propellant, chemical rocket propellant. And that has tremendous leverage on the mission. And that's the basis, in fact, of my Mars Direct plan, which is explained at length in my book, The Case for Mars, and which subsequently became the core, not in every detail, but in the central way to the SpaceX Mars plan, is based on making methane oxygen on Mars, using power on Mars, and that power is going to have to be nuclear. Longer term, if we're talking about actual nuclear propulsion, this is essential if we're going to reach the stars. And it probably has to be fusion. And going to the stars is hard. But a fusion rocket could achieve velocities up to 10% the speed of light, which is enough to get you to Alpha Centauri in 40 years. And we don't know anything else that can do that. So that's an introductory capability for interstellar travel, and we can do it with fusion power.
Wow. Well, do you have anything to say in conclusion?
Well, in conclusion, I would just like to urge people to get the book, The Case for Nukes, and help spread the truth.
Do you have that book with you, by the way?
I do.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay.
Very nice.
You can get a
very
good
nice.
picture of it on the Amazon
I'm
in
sure.
either a paperback or Kindle format.
Great. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us, and it's been a pleasure. Please join us next week, and when we'll be back on for the Eco-Modernist Soapbox.
All right.
Okay.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot.
Hi, this is Carl. At our Friends of Fission Northwest, I want to announce we have a great guest that's coming up in just a few weeks, Miss Grace Stanke. She got the title of Miss America. She's a nuclear engineer, and she is touring the country to talk about nuclear energy. So if you are in the Seattle area, go to Town Hall Seattle, and please go ahead and pick up a ticket to see Miss Grace Stanke. We would love to have you. You can meet Miss America and learn about what she is doing as a nuclear engineer to save the climate.